Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling, founder and MD of Hut22 Limited, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Marina Bradford, founder of Bemari Consulting. Hi, Marina.
Hello, morning. Thank you very much for having me here.
Oh, no problem. Thanks very much for coming on. You have just got back from the latest Nature COP, and you're saying you're perhaps still a little bit jet lagged, still dealing with the time zone difference. But let's start, hopefully, with what is a reasonably easy question, no research required. What would be great is if you could just perhaps give us a potted history of how your journey in sustainability led you to found Bemari.
Sure, that's normally the most challenging question. I started my career in one of the big four, qualifying as an accountant, and then that opened up a whole world of different types of businesses across the world to me. That was really fascinating to see. So that's kind of really where the journey started. What do I do with these skills and these insights and do something that's positive and creates a little bit more of an excitement than just creating business success, which is really important for many people, and started exploring different models. So I moved around different consulting formats, different organizations, discovered something called social enterprise, which was a massive revelation to me at the time, and then started to look at different spaces like public sector, private sector, NGO, kind of trying to figure out where my skills versus the problems that I would like to be part of solving would be a good match. So having tried a few different things in large and big organizations and working internationally and exploring kind of what these models are, I figured that actually probably this intersection of cross-functional change and interpreting what it means for business, like the big things, but what it actually means in terms of actions, is kind of the space I like being in. And so I didn't quite see at the time an organization where I could be doing things the way I wanted to do them and the kind of things I want to do them. And having spent some time around people who were doing their own thing, I kind of figured, why not? What's the worst that can happen? And that's pretty much it. 8.5 years ago, I went freelance and then over time formed an agency, and we are a small consultancy now.
Brilliant. So 8.5 years ago. So you've got loads of experience of kind of, running a business in this space. Has Bemari always worked in the space that it's in now? Maybe just kind of summarize the sort of types of work that you do.
Yeah, I think it's evolved a little bit. So the starting point was sustainable procurement and impact-driven investment and fund management, so with various international organizations. So sustainability in kind of different aspects has always been there, but I think social impact was the initial iterations of that. And then environmental elements came in because we were working across different countries and kind of going in country and seeing physical implications of the various activities. Kind of spurred that idea. So what we work on now is climate, nature, circularity, and in simple language, we help organizations understand their environmental impact, whether of their activities, business or products, build strategies to improve it and to align it to more regenerative thinking. I'm going to say realign because no business can be regenerative right now, but we can aim in that direction. Nature positive, because climate is one aspect, but there's going to be wider. So what is the nature positive contribution that a business can actually shape? And along that journey, because ultimately that's transformation and change management married with numbers, we support with training and making sure that there's an understanding of all of these issues within the business. So one day we might do ourselves out of a job, and that'll be a good day.
Wow. Do you know what? It's interesting, isn't it? I've often said that to other people in sustainability. What we're ultimately aiming for is hopefully not to have a job at some point. But the other thing I've noticed is it is constantly changing as well. It's really interesting that you kind of started in that finance space and then kind of looked at the impact of how you spend money to start with, and then the impact of spending the money, and kind of eventually you end up at this point where you're thinking about the risks associated with spending money, the risks associated with the operations of businesses and other types of organizations. So you focus, amongst other things, there on kind of climate risk and nature risk and that kind of stuff. Maybe we'll get into the nature stuff later if we get time, but maybe let's just start with climate risk. I think maybe a lot of people perhaps aren't quite sure what we mean by climate risk. I'm sure we see things like, flooding and wildfires and all those sorts of things. But for a business, translating that into kind of a language I understand is something maybe that lots of businesses haven't really kind of got to grips with yet. So maybe you could just explain to us what we mean when we say climate risk from a business point of view.
Sure. So climate risk is basically anything that might affect business or environment that it operates within as a result of climate change, right? So it may just be simply that the physical conditions are changing. So that's the weather conditions, that the conditions in the sea that the ships have to go through, and we no longer can predict when the safe passage might be. Or maybe something falls on the roof of your house that did not belong there, like a huge piece of hail, and that might have implications for the integrity of the roof or that particular office. So there can be physical changes, and the risks associated with that are different to what we've known of before, because context is different. But it also might mean that it's more sort of what we call transitional risks. So it's the non-physical manifestations. So that might mean regulations, they changing because there needs to be a response around this. As people learn a little bit more about climate change, their expectations of what business might want or the kind of products or services they would demand would also be different. It may be that technology starts to shift, or maybe the products that you're selling or services that you're offering are just simply not fit for purpose because they cannot really service any kind of need in the circumstances or in the kind of conditions. So it's really any of the changes that will have consequences on a business in financial sense, or in sense of being able to operate in a safe environment, and on people as part of that business. So it's just too hot to sit in the office in some countries during the day. You may have to shift your working hours, or people may not be able to do what they normally would be doing because of the health conditions. So there'll be lots of different things. But in essence, what we're talking about, climate changes, context is very different. We haven't lived through that before. We don't know what it looks like and what it means for the business, but we cannot do business as usual. That's climate risk.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I mean, a couple of things in there, I suppose. Firstly, the breadth of the risks is really, it's perhaps quite surprising when you dig into it and you think, oh, maybe we might get flooded, or maybe, there might be a storm or something, particularly in the UK where the weather's really quite benign, really, most of the time. It's not extreme like it is in other places, or at least most of the time it's not. But yeah, the breadth of those risks and people kind of understanding that is really important, isn't it? So there are plenty of businesses who are thinking about this stuff. Probably larger businesses with maybe a few more resources and maybe a team dedicated to thinking about sustainability of the business and all that kind of stuff. But there are also plenty of businesses who aren't thinking about it. And for some of those, I guess maybe if they took just a moment to think, it may be that some of them think that they aren't affected by it. But if they took a moment to think about it, they probably realised that they were. And I've seen you talk about this idea of risk, talk about these risks in terms of kind of myths that people almost tell themselves, so that, I mean, I don't know if it's willingly or unwillingly really, but it kind of leads to the fact that they don't do anything about it. And of course, that in itself is a risk. Maybe would you mind talking us through some of those common myths that you've seen, that I've seen you talk about before?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think they're not sort of maliciously, intentionally trying to sort of slow down action, but I think sometimes there's a bit of confusion because there's so much new language and new terminology, a new concept that maybe not everybody has the time and mind space to kind of figure it out quickly. But maybe we can start with the first one, which is probably the easier one. So climate mitigation equals climate adaptation. Sometimes the two terms get interchangeably used and a little bit mixed up. But the mitigation side of things is basically, what is the business going to do about reducing its impact on climate? So carbon emissions, or in business context, there's a bit more to that, obviously, than just that particular action. But that is the key question. So we're thinking about, what is our emissions? What is our contribution? How can we add to any of the climate solution investment, mangroves, for example, or any kind of other areas which actually sequester carbon? So we're reducing that impact that then creates the accelerated climate change. The adaptation bit is when you kind of go, well, climate is different now. We're going to have to live with this. So how are we going to live in this situation and minimize the impact on us rather than slow down the onset of it? And so those would be the areas where you're trying to make sure that your house is, proof for the flooding, or for the weather conditions, and the coastal resilience and coastal communities needs to be strengthened. So they're kind of different things. They often have to and should go hand in hand, because there isn't going to be one solution around this. But it is important to understand that they also have a kind of a feedback loop. So the faster we can mitigate, i.e. reduce the emissions and kind of slow down the change, the less we would need to adapt to it, because the less of an unknown environment we're going to find ourselves in. So two sides of the same coin, but not quite the same.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important that everybody recognizes, I suppose, that some degree of adaptation is going to be required whatever else we do, because that's where we are. We're at a point where it's baked in. Some of those changes are baked in, aren't they? Even if we stop if we do 100% of whatever we need to do to mitigate emissions today, we're still going to get change tomorrow that we're going to need to adapt to.
Climate change is here. It's just the
Yep,
question is how much more of it and how fast, right?
that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. That's a good one.
Well, that's actually a really good segue into the next one. Next myth, which is climate change is a risk in the future. It's not affecting us right now, but as we know, it very much is. And I probably don't need to tell you about the various events that happen around the world and may have happened very early last week that we probably have seen in a European country. So, things like that. So massive floods or wildfires or any kind of events that cause a lot of disruption are already happening, have been happening. And they cost money and they cost lives and they cost a lot of disruption. So obviously the Spain flooding was one example, but the other one I like to share because people feel like it's really far away. It's not really happening to us. And as you said, weather in the UK isn't really something that's kind of lends itself to extremes, it seems. A couple of years ago, there was a standstill in Luton Airport because a piece of tarmac melted. And when I say piece of tarmac, it literally was a very small piece of tarmac and it melted. And as a result, obviously, they had to fix that. So safety, security issues, and the planes could not take off or land. So they shut down the airport. So now if you think about, what's climate risk and what's climate risk implications, a tiny piece of tarmac was not designed for the kind of temperature we are now experiencing in the UK. Now let's imagine the rest of the countries and the infrastructure in other places and parts of the world, but this now costs money. So those delays, the people who couldn't get somewhere or couldn't arrive to somewhere, and all of the kind of repair work in itself probably is less problematic. But this is an example where it's here, it happens to us, and it's in places you probably wouldn't necessarily always think.
I mean, that's absolutely right, isn't it? One of the things that I often hear is when we talk about those extreme weather events, like the stuff in Valencia that we're recording shortly after those terrible floods in Valencia, is that, well, we've always had floods, or we've always had the odd wildfire, whatever. And the kind of message I think we need to get across as professionals in this space is that, yes, of course, we understand we've always had those things. They've always occurred in the past, but they're more regular, they're more likely, and they're more extreme. And that's only going to increase. All of those things are going to become more regular, more likely, more extreme over the course of from now until we stabilize whenever we're going to get to that point, hopefully. Brilliant.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's one. It's not a thing that's in the future. It is happening now. Therefore, get your thinking caps on and do something about it.
Yep.
Okay. Yep.
The next one, we do not have any climate change risks because we're a small company and we're based in Europe. So what can possibly go wrong? And I guess in this case, then, some of the examples we just covered and the fact that, this is changing is just amplifying any kind of calamities that may have happened before. But the one thing to consider is also supply chains. So companies in Europe or in North America or in all over the world, really, depend on supply chains for the most part. And those supply chains are not always going to be in the same country where you sell your product. So how is climate change affecting those supply chains? How is it affecting the actual availability of material and resources? How is it affecting the ability to get them from A to B so your business can actually do something that it planned to do? How do you sell? And so some examples would be things like water stress in parts of the world where steel is manufactured. Water is a really big part of the process. It's a requirement, but if it's stressed, we don't have enough of it. It has to go to people first and only to industries after. It may cost more, just simply not be available. And CDP has said that water stress is a major risk for world's supply chain of steel. That's one example. And we can look simulate quite a few different other commodities. So that's a really big important part. We are a globalized world, and we obviously saw that during the pandemic. But in terms of climate change, we do need to have an understanding of where that risk actually might occur. So this point around transparency of supply chains and not having the transparency is a big, big climate risk, because if something were to happen somewhere in part of the world and we didn't know we were dependent on it, that would become an issue. And just the other one for the companies who are in the Northern Hemisphere and feel like they're not being affected is the transitional risks. So things like things we say and advertise and the kind of products that we are trying to offer to the market. And could that become greenwashing because we haven't quite thought through the kind of claim we're making, or we haven't quite got the information sufficient enough to back it up, or people's understanding has now moved on. So greenwashing has obviously been a big topic, but that is also a climate risk because this is coming from a better granular explanation, also exploration rather, of the topic. So we can no longer say just anything. And also an important part is greenwashing is really about what a person who reads it or looks at it understands rather than what it is. So this bit around society has moved on. That also has become a risk. And that's a big part of it.
That's right. I mean, I was really interested in that idea that some people feel like, it doesn't apply to them. I often have conversations with businesses that are quite small and already quite lean, so maybe they don't have a physical one central physical location, an office, maybe everybody works at home or something. And they kind of feel like there's nothing they can do around mitigation because they're already so lean. But both in mitigation and adaptation, it's everybody's it's everybody's lookout really. Everybody can kind of do something to reduce their emissions to do that mitigation part, and everybody can be affected by adaptation issues, as exactly as you say. So even if it's not directly for you, what if your clients get affected by a problem and suddenly they don't commission you for something because they're busy fixing a flood or they're busy doing something else, then obviously that is an issue. And water's a really interesting one, isn't it? I read the State of Global Water Resources report from the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, recently. And the thing that struck me about that report was that nowhere really was it all in one direction. So, it wasn't that everybody was suffering water shortages or everybody was being flooded. It was a real mix, and just kind of things at the extremes were becoming more common. That was the thing that really struck me with that report. From everything from, the availability of groundwater, the amount of discharge from river basins, the amount of precipitation, all of that stuff. So really, a really interesting report, that one.
And just to maybe actually just to connect the water issue to something you just said earlier in terms of smaller companies and nowhere to go and decarbonization, think of digital services. The one thing we all are dependent on, big or small, is digital services and energy consumption around all of that. Digital is not actually in a cloud that is, intangible. It's very much under the water or underground instead of in marine environment. It's a physical infrastructure. And therefore it requires materials, it requires energy, and it requires water for those service and data processing. So if nothing else, the one thing we can do is to slim down the digital footprint and consider what that is, because the more energy we use, the more water is required and the more generally energy is needed as well. So that's one space, and probably in this, in terms of digital, has zero impact. No, it does not.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I remember some research from a long while ago that looked at the impact of every email that you send, and also looked at the impact of, that thing that happens. You get a report, like that WMO report, for instance. If I want to share that with people, I could attach that to an email, send it to 50 people, and actually that's actually pretty impactful. Sending that big attachment to all of those people rather than, for example, sending them a link to it, and then if they want to, they can download it somewhere. But we share so much data, even just things like taking photos on your phone and storing them in the cloud somewhere. It's literally everything, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And people really do think, and the point you make about it feeling intangible, feeling like it's just something that doesn't exist and there's no physical kind of impact to it, is so far off the mark, isn't it? That's a fascinating area, really. And another one of those things where it's kind of part of the supply chain, right? It's kind of part of your supply chain. You buy those services from somebody somewhere is providing those services to you. So another example of how kind of spending budgets and the way that you spend them is really impactful.
That's where the power of spend in business, procurement, and supply chain. I've always said supply chain people and procurement people are the superheroes, because ultimately that is the gatekeeping position and the gateway to decisions and the impact maximization or minimization, depending which kind of you're trying to do. Positive impact max and minimum of the negative. But yeah, sort of, money does speak, but essentially how you spend and who you spend with is the most powerful thing we can do as businesses as well as individuals. So that's really key.
It's so interesting you say that. So in one of the hack books that's on the website, the governance one, I talk about the three kind of areas. That you talk about responsibility, talk about accountability, but I also talk about spending, because as soon as you move beyond, if we're talking about mitigation now, but as soon as you move beyond those technical fixes, it's all about, I mean, if you make physical products, it's obviously about what happens to those and the way those are used. But for all businesses, that supply chain, the spending your money on the goods and services that you buy becomes absolutely critical to reducing that massive kind of 80% plus of your actual carbon footprint. It's so important. In fact, I'm doing a talk tomorrow on exactly that subject. Okay, brilliant. That's great. Thank you. What's the next one?
I think the next one is, aren't regulations challengeable and governments do backtrack? So let's just wait and see, shall we? And I think this is the
Oh, yeah.
one favorite for many, isn't it? Because, who knows? And we have an alphabet soup and we have so many different reporting regulations. What if the next one is going to be different? So I think,
Because do nothing is always an option.
and that's going to be so much easier, right? And I think actually that's a really good example of an illustration that no matter what the reporting requirements are, climate change is still there, physical implications of that is still there, and organizations who are actually able to take them into account and start looking at what their supply chain looks like and where the risk might come from are simply securing their own future. So if you're dependent on agricultural products in one way or another, you may be a cosmetics company, you may be drinks, you may be pharmaceuticals, you may be in lots of different parts where you do have some sort of reliance on agriculture, even textile and fashion, really. They may not be availability of crops that you need, or there may not be as many types of crops or as much volume as you need to get your market share. And so those kind of situations is really just for your business rather than for reporting. We do know that regulation comes later than we would like it to be in place. And that's because by that point, it really is becoming a problem. So looking at the climate risk issues and really about the regulator, and it really is just securing the resilience of the business and the viability in medium and long term. But the other element there is it is just simply cheaper to prevent, because change is going to happen one way or another. It's either going to happen to you and you will not be expecting it and you will not be ready and it's going to be really expensive, Kodak moment, or we can anticipate it and we can start thinking about how do we prepare, how do we pivot, and how do we change. There's a couple of examples there. For example, Ørsted is a very famous example. Whatever you might wish to think about oil and gas company, they've just looked at it and kind of gone, there is no future for it. And therefore, our business needs to still remain alive in the future. So what shall we do? The future is in renewables. And they pivoted, and if you're going to wait for all of the regulators to come in, that isn't going to happen. And actually, one of the key messages from COP that I can share is a lot of panelists and people from various organizations, including reporting organizations, have said, do not wait for them to come on board. We have enough tools, we have enough information, we have enough understanding to take action. Do it before any of that reporting requirement comes in. And if it backtracks after it has come in, if something has then become more lax, it's not because it's no longer necessary. There are lots of other reasons why that happens, and we all know what they might be, but that's not really going to help your business. So it's really just about centering around the viability and success, and it's not going to do you harm.
This is an absolutely fascinating area, isn't it? Because of course, we know that regulations, the purpose of regulations is to kind of put a floor in the performance. So it's a minimum standard. So if all you're doing is complying with regulations, you really are doing the bare minimum that is required. And that's okay, I suppose. Plenty of businesses will be in that position. And I guess we often hope for regulations to go a bit further and a bit quicker than they do, but nonetheless, I can understand why some businesses want to be there for some regulations. One thing that you talked about was it's cheaper to prevent, it's cheaper to be prepared, it's cheaper to do all that stuff. I guess there is also in a lot of instances an early mover advantage. So if many companies don't want to be right at the very front of the curve, but they certainly don't want to be at the back, so they want to kind of be just behind that kind of first wave. But I guess there is often an advantage to being first to do something, first to market with a new sustainable product, or the first to adopt a new way of doing things. Have you seen that happen anywhere?
There's definitely opportunities in this, because it could be a completely new market that you could create, or it could be a different way of creating a business model and revenues. So there's a number of brands who've gone, and kind of started to change that. I mean, one example that I actually do really like is Selfridges. Maybe surprising for some, but I have heard them talk and have seen some of the work that they've been doing. And, you'd think it's a department store and it's luxury department store. But actually what they're trying to do is they're trying to shift to the revenue from circular business models. And they have defined what the proportions should be. They've defined what those models are. And they've started experimenting with how those circular models can actually be introduced. And that first mover advantage becomes advantageous to them, but also becomes something that starts to shift the market. So they have incubated and supported a number of different startups in circular space that have since gone off and started supporting other department stores or just build their own business on their own. So for example, I think it's the Restory, I think it's the bag repair and shoe repair. There's Sojo, which is a great story, which was founded by a wonderful woman. But then now they've partnered up with Selfridges as well, so just gives kind of amplification to the notion of repair and to the notion that service, does not have to be something you're looking for. And those kind of partnerships where, both parties benefit is really, really powerful, but also it shifts the industry because it doesn't have to be something that just Selfridges does. And that's actually what I really love about that example, because oftentimes companies find an opportunity and they kind of just want it to be theirs, whereas actually it's a whole market. And if all of the market can start benefiting from, then everybody starts to shift, because it stops being a non-commercial offer. It stops being something you'd lose money if you do, and everybody can actually start going further. So some of really good examples around actually just sort of innovating. But one thing, it probably is a long game, but along that way, there's a lot of, really great opportunity that can be built out, and it shifts the behaviors of customers. And that's what's necessary as well to create new models and start shifting to make sure that advantage is beneficial.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to that myth that not the one that we tell ourselves, but the myth that industry tells us, which is about kind of you always need something new, right? You always need the next thing. You always need the next phone. The repair of shoes and bags is great. I've had to retire a pair of shoes just recently after having, I don't know how many new insoles put in, how many new soles have been put on there. It's a sad day when you have to, retire your shoes. I know, but it does happen. But it would be brilliant if all those things. I live in a kind of a largish village in Gloucestershire, and our local TV repair shop closed a few years ago, and now I literally have no idea where to go to get it fixed. And the reason is we had a TV, it went wrong, and I phoned the guy and I said, can you come and fix this? I think it's just the power supply. He said, I can't get those parts. I just can't get them. Manufacturers don't make them. It's like, what? It's madness.
Really
anyway,
that's really sad.
It is sad. But this point about it's cheaper to act and to prevent than not to do that in the long term. The difference there for a business, I suppose, is that investment comes much earlier than the kind of negative impact which might come later. So there's two things in there. One is that we can't be sure exactly what that risk looks like in the future, because of course that's always going to be some degree of speculation. But also, spending money now is more painful than potentially spending it in the future. So have you got any thoughts about, and this is the thing I always kind of wrestle with, how do companies today think about assessing the value of doing something which might prevent something in the future? That idea of kind of how do you build that into your kind of forecasts and stuff?
Sure. And I think part of it is just sort of actually breaking it down into constituent parts rather than thinking about like this big horrible thing, but it's not really that horrible right now, so we're fine. It's just sort of breaking it down into a bit of scenario. So in climate world, scenario planning, but in a very simple term, if a risk were to materialize, what would actually happen? So if one of my core ingredients was no longer available or became 30% more expensive, what would that cost me? And what would it cost me in terms of, maybe finding substitution at the time, or, would I be able to even produce my products at that time? And if you start thinking about it like today, you don't have that problem yet, but you can kind of start visualizing that and thinking in financial terms and go, okay, so what if I were to reduce my reliance on that ingredient, or maybe like reformulate it now, and maybe I still have like 2-3 years. So actually I spread out the cost of doing that, and then I like de-risked it for myself. So the numbers aren't real yet, but you can start actually comparing something to something, and you also got time to start phasing things in and to start testing and to start kind of shifting a little bit. It's when it becomes, immediate and the entirety of it, that's when it's problematic. But for example, in tourist businesses, I won't name the actual organization, but that's an example we always look at. One of the tour providers said, we don't have any climate risks. We send a lot of people to Europe. We send a lot of people to different parts of the world. climate risk is not a problem for us.
No.
And the following year, that very organization suffered 25 million because of wildfires in Greece. So it's this kind of
Wow.
things,
Yeah.
kind of thinking about when it hits, it's going to be painful. We don't want it to happen. If you don't want it to happen tomorrow, because there's much more than money that's at stake. But it's just kind of considering, what can be done and how do we kind of predict some of those things, because there are tools that can help us model it. There are ways that you can start kind of scenario plan. We cannot forecast every single thing, of course, but just thinking about, what is the worst case scenario? How would that affect me? And so what are the steps I can take today, and just start putting them, one foot in front of the other probably would be one way, but kind of estimating. And one thing with the costs as well, it's not just the cost of a particular event. If hail drops on your car, it's not just the cost of the repair of the car. There's going to be insurance, there's going to be moving the car, there's going to be.
Yes.
So this cost is going to start adding up. And that's the thing to consider, what would be the implication of a particular event? And that overall might actually be much more significant than taking action today.
Yeah, it's kind of creating those. I mean, most decisions in business, or well, they always have some financial element, don't they? There's always some kind of financial strand in that decision making process, whatever it might be. And I think a lot of people kind of struggle to think about and to find ways to, because you can easily quantify the cost of the thing that you might do today, but it's much more challenging to quantify the cost of the thing that you might have to do tomorrow, or next day, or 2 years time, or 3 years time. And that's always a bit of a challenge, isn't it? But yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. And the next one, what's the next one? Maybe this is the last one, I'm not sure.
I think this is the last one, isn't it? So it's all too vague, which I guess is kind of also building what we're saying. So when we say it's all too vague, it's somewhere out there. We don't really know what it means. But as I mentioned, there are tools and there are ways we can start sort of thinking about things very specifically. So in terms of the vagueness, one way to maybe think about climate risk, it's like the SPF. And we get lots of messages from everywhere. We have to wear SPF and 50 plus every day because the sun and what the sun does. So really it's about, we know what the hazard is, sun exposure, climate change. We just have to protect ourselves. And so the question is, what kind of exposure is most relevant to you? If you're going to be in Greece, if you're going to be somewhere in Egypt, or if you're going to be in the UK, you will have different exposure. So you're going to kind of worry about it more or less, but you know how to find out what kind of temperature and sun exposure there is. We have that information. So if you live somewhere on a coastal line, you're probably going to be subject to some sort of flood risk. So you can go and have a look. How is my area looking specifically? So do I need to do anything about it? Is my house protected? Is my business route access or roads or my office access are going to be protected? Do I need to speak to the city council? Or do I need to do anything myself? So as an office or as a manufacturing facility, some organizations have never looked at it and it becomes a bit of a surprise. But for example, if you have really important warehouse with really sensitive material stored in there and you're in a flood zone risk, you can actually kind of figure out before that actually happens and maybe reinforce and do something about that. And that has happened to some of our clients as well. We can, it's fine, it's not going to be really there. And like, we had a flooding, and if 1 centimeter higher, the consequence will be quite damaging. So, so we have maps, we have tools, there's lots of, online, paid or free, that people can start looking at. But the key thing is understanding, so what is most relevant to your business? And that would be site specific, that would be location specific, or specific to the particular input that we're looking at. So making it very real would be really helpful. And I do recommend companies look at TCFD guidelines, because it breaks down the types of risks and gives you examples of physical risks or transitional risks and opportunities. We talk about risk all the time, but there are opportunities here as well. So it kind of doesn't sound right to talk about climate change opportunities, but as a business, we have to find the positive way there. And so just breaking it down, is it regulation? Is it going to be customer changes? Is it going to be supply chain resilience? Is it going to be offices? Is it flooding, or is it the heat? There's going to be different things. We don't have to solve for them all, but just understanding what's specifically most important. Country level information is often available for free. There are various, flood risk filters and water stress filters, and obviously regulation trackers. And companies kind of do look at their customer directions and market trends as well. So just bring it down to the top 2 things that are relevant for your business, and that becomes a bit more manageable. And at that point, it just becomes business as usual. you manage other risks, that's just one of the other risks you will be managing the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've recommended before that, you know, climate goes onto the corporate risk register somewhere. Absolutely. If it's not already, then it needs to be treated just like any other business risk, really.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned the TCF guidelines, which is great. And if you're thinking about the physical risk for a site in particular, the UK GBC, I think, provides some guidance as well about UK Green Building Council, provides some guidance about how to go about doing that risk assessment for buildings, which I think would be a useful thing for people to do if they've got any kind of physical facility. Amazing. I mean, that's such a good roundup of all those kind of myths that people either tell themselves or they kind of choose to believe or whatever, you know, so they maybe don't do quite as much as they perhaps could or should do. And when we're thinking about risks, it's true, isn't it, that we talked about the UK climate being a bit more benign than other places, but there are some places in the world which are at incredible levels of risk right now today. You know, these are really day-to-day real issues that people are having to deal with in their lives. And you did some work with Tuvalu, didn't you? Which I mean, people probably have heard of Tuvalu, but if they haven't, it's a small kind of archipelago, a couple of thousand miles off the coast of Australia, just east and a little north. So maybe you could just tell us about what you did for Tuvalu.
Sure. So I did have the opportunity, and very grateful to have visited Tuvalu. So that actually was my dream for about 17 years after discovering by accident a book about Tuvalu and somebody going there. So the work was actually as part of the sort of broader piece of work we're doing with the UN around the environmental impact of elections, electoral processes, and climate risk to electoral processes. Okay. And that obviously becomes really significant for countries globally that may find themselves in very different situations in terms of how climate affects them. So sort of that aspect in the island nations becomes really, really critical, because if you think about what any kind of elections or logistical processes are, lots of stuff has to come into the country at a certain time frame and timeline, and lots of events have to take place on a schedule with various goods and people being in the right places at the right times. And when you're an island, that means flying, that means boats, that means kind of challenges around getting to, and it also means stormy weather at some parts of the year. And hopefully they are not at the same time as the elections, but very often that happens exactly at the same time. So with Tuvalu, that actually was sort of piece of exploratory kind of mission to understand how the electoral processes are happening and what challenges they have had due to climate change. But what's really interesting about Tuvalu is that is the ground zero for climate change. And if anybody has ever heard of Tuvalu, hopefully it wasn't in the context of climate change, but for many people it probably was, because they have talked about how it affects their island. And it's actually an archipelago, so there's multiple very small islands, and the biggest one, Funafuti, is where you've got the landing strip, and that's the place we were seeing. But what you see there is essentially what climate change does. So it's the sea level rises. It affects agriculture because the groundwater starts rising up through the soil. So obviously that then contaminates, and you can't really grow as much. It's the challenges of access to that particular island, and it has an effect on every part of life, from food to waste management to what happens when the sea level rises and that floods the island, and kind of all of the various implications around that. It's a beautiful place and people absolutely love it, and they really just want to live on their own island, Tuvalu, because it's associated with the memories. It's their family. That's where everything they know has been. But that's as a good example of what climate change can mean if you kind of amplify and accelerate it. And that's probably something we will not see in this country or maybe in European countries, but really important to know. It starts affecting not just in infrastructure or business or way to make money. It affects people's lives and what a meaning of a nation is. So one of the things that, with Tuvalu, because obviously a small island, they're not going to be in a lot of space at the moment, they're predicting it might go underwater if nothing is done. But they do a lot of really cool stuff. They have a lot of adaptation measures. They have innovated around how that can happen. They can come up with the solutions. Often it can be a money thing, amongst other things. But, that's one of the challenges for Tuvalu. But how do we look at climate change, and how do we decide that these people just need to relocate and it'll all be fine? How do we disconnect people from what made them a nation and what made that home? those are the kind of things that start coming up in terms of what climate change can do. So displacement, obviously, people having to move around, and not just in the context of elections, but that's what climate change does for people, a lot of parts of the world. And in Tuvalu, because it's so small and so concentrated, you really can just see that, you can see those beaches, and you can see the parts which previously used to be above water, they're not totally there anymore. You can see what it does in terms of the corals, and you can see in terms of the fishing. We've spoken to some fishermen, and I've never seen such apocalyptic landscapes underwater. I have done diving before. Wow. I've seen corals, I've seen alive corals. I've never really seen corals that are bleached amongst the non-bleached, because that's what gives you an idea of how bad things are. And the fishermen also say in the last 10 years, they've been seeing this, they haven't really seen much fish. So lots of things starting to come into this. It's not just it gets a little bit hot or a little bit wet or a little bit more flooding. All of these different things affect all of the different movements, and all of that is in Tuvalu, as well as other Pacific Island and Pacific and island nations. But Tuvalu is one of those places where it starts to raise those questions. And some of the questions can also be, how much money is needed to save something like that? What solutions are needed to save something like that? And where does that come from? That kind of takes us in a bigger kind of COP conversation and sort of bigger nations, smaller nations discussion. But those become really important things when we start talking about the mitigation is definitely so much cheaper, so much more effective. So people do not have to think about, do I need to leave my island and move to Australia or New Zealand or wherever else because it's just flooded and that can only recover it? Like, we should not be having to think about that. So as a scale of a country or as a scale of a business, it is always cheaper and always so much better to try and prevent it, because the costs are way beyond just money. And I think that's the one key message to take away from Tuvalu. It's not about just the money, even though we put those numbers onto things because TCFD tells us to do so. We only do that because that's the language businesses understand. But what we do need to understand, it is not about the money. It is much bigger than that.
Yeah. I mean, that's so powerful, isn't it? That notion of climate justice is really kind of strong in that particular, and lots of other cases as well, of course. That idea that they are the people who are most vulnerable, but they are some of the people who are least responsible for the things that we're seeing for mankind's impact on the climate. And of course you mentioned nature as well, and nature is so kind of intertwined with this. We haven't got probably enough time to explore the whole of kind of impacts around nature and nature risks at the moment, so maybe we could come back and do that another time. Maybe that would be something that we could talk about on a separate occasion. But for now, I think we'll probably wrap it up. So where can people find more information about Bemari and the work they do?
On the website, bemari.co.uk, or on our LinkedIn page, Bemari, and you can follow me and my team members individually as well. But I just want to actually, if I may, connect, because this is like a really important point. Whilst climate and nature are always discussed separately, businesses should never separate them because they are interconnected. Climate is part of nature and nature services. And if we have to address the two together. So whilst we have learned the language of climate risk, or we are learning the language of climate risk, we do need to start getting into nature train and nature impact, because they're very much interconnected. If we just solve for nature, that will help us with climate. If we just focus on climate, we will have bigger problems on our hands. So some of that will also be on our website and the blogs and the content we've tried to put out, but I'm also happy to chat about that in more detail.
Yes, that would be great. I mean, I follow Howard Dryden on LinkedIn, who is a marine biologist, absolutely fascinating. And his strong and consistent message is that issues such as the acidification of the oceans will be a much bigger problem than atmospheric carbon if we don't solve that. And it really speaks to that link between nature and climate, and that we need to kind of fix both of those things at the same time. So yeah, let's absolutely get back together and talk about those links. But for now,
perfect.
Marina, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you very much, Kev, for a great conversation.